Well, welcome everybody. I'm very pleased that people were able to come tonight. And I wasn't quite sure how to present what is actually, first of all, a very large report that was published in late December. And this was preceded by a similarly sized report in July. But basically, these reports are examining public understandings of not just climate change, but natural disasters and environmental threat generally. And I'll talk about some of our principal findings, but rather immediately get into this encountering climate change, is seeing believing, because it addresses many aspects of the public debate about climate change. But I guess my real objective is to just share more of a psychological perspective on climate change. We hear so much about the threat of climate change, the contested political landscape, and images, often profoundly frightening images, of how the world might be altering. But we don't hear so much about how are people really understanding this, and not only how they're understanding it, but how they're being impacted by not just climate change, but media coverage of climate change and the debates that are out there. And a lot of my own work in the past has been about a variety of environmental threats, everything from the nuclear threat to natural disasters, to hybrid disasters where there's a human hand in whatever it is that's happening. There's been huge research effort, on nanotechnology, GM foods, you name it. And climate change seems to be emerging as a risk domain that actually shares some interesting common denominators. And that's really interesting when you're looking at human response. But anyway, I'll kind of go through a presentation that has a kind of logic to it and a narrative. And we'll see where we can get to. And can I say that I'm presenting on behalf of some colleagues that I'm working on with this. One of them, Graham Bradley, is in the audience. And I hopefully won't say anything that he couldn't live with, but he's been a core part of this. And so I'm one voice talking, but the work is reflecting the work of 4 or 5 rather dedicated people. Just to give you a feel about the program itself very quickly, we are looking at the social representation of climate change and natural disasters, and that encompasses partly how people collectively are making sense of this phenomena, and then how it's represented. In social psychology, social representations are anything that really carries messages to the public about the nature of reality. And so it could be images, text, many other things. We're also very interested in public risk perceptions, understandings, and responses. And we're going way beyond attitudes and knowledge and opinion and where the political constituency is at. We're trying to get at a deeper level of understanding, looking at risk as feeling as well as risk as analysis with respect to this particular phenomena. We're also very interested in the impacts, not just of the phenomena and its unfolding physical environmental impact, but the impacts of the media coverage of this phenomena. And also, very importantly, we think the climate change research community has to pay more attention to monitoring and measuring what's happening in the human landscape in response to these unfolding events. Because not very much of that is happening, and yet it's crucially important, not only in terms of climate change adaptation, but if we want to get serious about climate change mitigation. And finally, the establishment of a real database, standardized measures, and a research platform from which we can begin to make sense out of human response, out of how humans are making sense of climate change. And a kind of poster, if you want, or conceptual map that I've been using is the one before you. And a lot of climate change science is really about scientists working in the field, in situ, looking at the changes that are taking place. But of course, journalists are covering what they do. A lot of scientists are actually watching the 6:30 news, and they're rather influenced by the social representation of climate change as well. And we have all kinds of social representations that are out there by way of TV coverage, documentaries, all of the manifestations of the new media, the information environment that's out there. And of course, individuals are trying to make sense out of all of this. They're also looking out their living room window at their approximate environment, trying to see, well, is it really happening here? Does it relate to me? They talk with other people. And so from a psychologist perspective, we're very interested in how this individual is making sense out of all of that. But we're also interested in the kinds of processes that are involved as we go from scientific reporting to the media coverage and the representation to how individuals are making sense of this. And of course, what's really important is this individual's personal experience of changes in their environment. So I'll come back to that, but it just lays out the landscape, if you want. And a social psychologist like myself, I'd be as interested in what Time magazine is doing in terms of risk communications to the public as I am with how this individual is thinking and feeling about this and also behaving in response to climate change. And from an environmental psychology perspective, every individual has an internal environment that they have to regulate and monitor and manage as well. And so what's going on inside this individual is also of real importance, particularly in terms of psychological impacts. Okay, so there's a report that I've distributed copies of the executive summary. This is a report mostly based on our 2011 survey, but it compares 2011 findings with 2010 findings. You can see that the numbers of respondents in both surveys really adds up to almost 7,500 people. It's a pretty big survey. And it's stratified across Australia in terms of relative exposure to both natural disasters and putative climate change impacts. And also we tried to have quite a balanced coverage of everything from small country towns to urban centers to coastal communities to inland communities, et cetera. And we feel that we've covered that pretty well. But it's a stratified sample which approximates a representative sample of the Australian population. And our sample is not so different from the statistical profile of Australia. And the basic findings, which I'll just run through quickly because I'll be referring to them, but just give you an idea of what we found in the second survey, was that 74% of Australians personally thought that climate change was occurring, with 69% very or fairly certain that this was happening. And that's a very conservative statement because we asked people what they personally thought about the situation based on their own knowledge. 69% of respondents either strongly agreed or tended to agree with the statement, I am certain that climate change is really happening. 87% of respondents believed that human activities were playing a causal role in climate change. 45% of respondents reported having had direct personal experience of an environmental change or event likely due to climate change. 42% reported it being a problem right now. 64% reported being very or fairly concerned about climate change. If you looked at people who expressed some level of concern, it's actually 88%. So we've been pretty conservative in our executive summary in terms of what our findings are saying. 43% reported it was an extremely or quite important issue to them personally. 20% of respondents reported feeling at times appreciable distress at the prospects and implications of climate change. So that's a rather subclinical measure of distress, but we still think it's quite important. And well over half of respondents reported being prepared to greatly reduce their energy use to tackle climate change, and many are psychologically adapting to climate change, and I'll explain as we go along what that's about. If we get right to the heart of the matter and the title of tonight's talk, we asked respondents in 2010, have you ever experienced any noteworthy changes or events in your local natural environment over the past 10 years which you think might be due to climate change? 35.7% thought that that was the case with respect to their local area. 24.5% had directly experienced environmental changes or events taking place elsewhere in Australia or the world. And if you take out the overlap, 45% of respondents reported such direct experiences of climate change. And that says something, actually, about acceptance and belief in climate change. If almost half the Australian publication think they've had a personal encounter with it, it doesn't sound like skepticism to me, but I'll come back to that. And very interestingly, those who reported having such encounters were very different to those who had not had such experiences. That is, they evidenced very different scores on almost all of our core psychological variables. And so a very interesting question is, well, why? How could that be the case? And what I'm going to present to you is kind of two narratives, because we not only looked at people's direct personal experience with climate change, we looked at people's direct personal experience with natural disasters. And we found some very interesting things which underscore the importance of this finding here. So if you ask people what these events and changes are, this is the kind of thing that you get. I'll just let you have a look at that, but people are giving rather anecdotal accounts of what happened to them or their house or what they saw. And interestingly, a lot of these are about changes in their known local landscape, but also a lot of these events are extreme weather events and natural disaster events. So when people are talking about their personal experience with climate change, we're getting a kind of a real understanding that, well, their understanding of these events is in terms of extreme weather events, or at least that's what they saw that led them to believe that they were directly experiencing climate change. And one could ask, well, how are these risk domains connected? In the public mind, if you want, is climate change very close to natural disasters? And that's certainly something we are looking at. But if you just look at media headlines, and these are from, I guess, a year and a half ago, the message is out there loud and clear that the media is drawing a connection here. That clearly influences what the public believes. And this is, of course, contrary to the strict climate change science view that it's very hard to attribute any particular event to climate change, which I have no argument with, but that's not how people operate. And so if you're taking a social science or psychological perspective and looking at public understandings, well, all of the evidence tells me there's a very strong climate change signal in the events that people in Australia are experiencing. If you look at more recent headline findings, and these are really just over the last couple weeks and months, I mean, look at some of them. Crazy weather shows impact of global warming. Scientists attribute extreme weather to man-made climate change. Our summer of truth. The name of the hurricane is climate change. It's out there in a very major way. And it seems strange to me that people aren't taking a bit more account of this. These are social representations, actually, of the nexus between climate change and extreme weather events. And we're sort of disregarding it as not an important source of evidence that's influencing public understandings. And if you directly ask the public, how much do you think climate change is influencing the frequency and intensity of weather events? The great majority are saying, well, of course they are. But all of this poses then some interesting questions. Does prior direct experience with natural disasters influence belief or acceptance of climate change? We hadn't been doing our research more than about 3 or 4 months before we were asked by NCARF whether that was the case. They were very interested in it. And one of the reasons we were looking at natural disasters is because our funding came from the disaster management NARP. So we had to look at natural disasters, which was fine by me because I had done a lot of work on natural disasters in Australia. And I could see that there were some interesting questions to be asked about the nature of these two risk domains. But also, a question which leaps to the mind of a researcher, if you want, is does perceived direct experience with an environmental event or change associated with climate change influence belief or acceptance of climate change? And does this depend on the nature of that experience and encounter, or perhaps the nature of the individual who's having the experience? And also, so much of our exposure to climate change is through the media. That's virtual, indirect, vicarious. And months ago, I would have said that's really what accounts for most of people's experience, but I'm not sure anymore because 45% of people are saying they've had their own personal experience. And of course, then we had the summer of disasters, which is continuing, it seems. And then what we tried to do, which nobody else has actually ever done before in Australia, is try to look at the life history of people's experience with disasters. And it's pretty substantial in Australia. We definitely get battered about. But more recently in the States, for example, in the last 2 years, some of the data is suggesting that they've had much more direct experience with disasters over this couple of years than we have had in Australia, notwithstanding the summer of disasters. If you look at the past 12 months, and now this is 2011 data, and look at the number of people who have experienced disasters in that 12-month period, it's really quite incredible. Over a lifetime, we were getting, I think, 34% of our respondents having had direct experience with one type of natural disaster or another. In this 12-month period, 29% of our respondents had experienced one type of disaster or another. And the number of people that experienced flooding, again from memory, I've got so many figures in my head, was about 26 or 27% of our national sample had had direct personal experience of flooding over that 12-month period. And a lot of people live in big cities where flooding isn't always such an issue, so those are rather interesting. And then when we asked people in 2011 about personally significant extreme weather or natural disaster situations to find out whether that really was significant. And, first of all, we found out that 45% of all of these had happened in the last 12 months, again, rather interesting. And then we used an impact of event scale, and this is often used in disaster research to find out, to look at the social health impacts of the disaster. But look at this last question. Did you at any point think that you were going to die? A tenth of our respondents thought that they were going to die in the disaster that they were involved in, either some years ago or more recently. So clearly there's a substantial psychological impact. However, when you look at whether people had disaster experience or not, these yes and no columns, and you looked at their scores on core psychological variables that we were using, there really wasn't much of a difference. It was though all this experience, this cumulative adversity with disasters really didn't matter very much in terms of the climate change psychological measures we were looking at. And we did correlations between cumulative disaster experience and all of these variables. And if you look across the top, you see that actually these correlations are pretty low. It's like disasters didn't seem to matter very much, particularly in terms of variables that were very classic psychological variables, but which were climate change specific. However, when we looked at these variables and whether people had direct experience with climate change impacts or not, and you compare those two groups, very high levels of significance right across the board for all of them. Well, what is going on there? How is it that this experience, and again, it's a perceived experience with climate change, could lead to such dramatic differences between these two groups of people who had the experience or who didn't have the experience? And very recently, Graham, again, who's here, he's divided all of our 2011 people into 4 groups. People that had neither climate change or disaster direct experience, those who had disaster experience but not climate change but not natural disaster, and both. And if you look at the middle ones, we're getting really the same result. Even for people with natural disaster experience but not climate change difference, we're finding very noteworthy differences across these two groups. And really you could say, well, basically these 2 columns here are all those people who haven't had climate change experience, even though many have had disaster experience. And these people have all had both, but actually there's not much difference between them. And what seems to be the kicker is the climate change experience. There's lots of theoretical explanations for this, and we don't have time to go through them all, but all that I can say is that, one genre of explanations has to do with the power of direct experience. Experience is the best teacher. You know, if you're in that situation, if your recollection of it is kind of imprinted, fixed by your emotional response and the nature of the experience, et cetera, it's pretty powerful. And there's a lot of research to support that. And of course, in the area of environmental education, we have 50 years of research saying that that kind of learning, experiential learning taking place in natural environments is very powerful. There's many convergent literatures with respect to risk perception and appraisal, and maybe something is going on where an individual just has a completely different perception of that risk, having directly experienced it, or maybe they just are making a different sense of climate change, a different sense of what's happening to the world because they've been touched by this direct experience. Another alternative explanation is that, well, really people want support for how they're looking at the world. If a person is accepting of climate change, it helps to look for evidence and find it. And is that a kind of believing is seeing phenomenon? And motivated reasoning is a kind of theoretical notion in psychology where you might have taken a position for no real reason. You just woke up in the morning and said, look, I'm a climate change skeptic. Well, you'd spend the next 10 years finding all the information that was around to support your point of view and not looking very hard at any other. Motivated reason just takes us down a particular path where we've already committed ourselves to thinking about the world in a particular way. And there's other explanations that are here. One that I think is really interesting is whether this is a transformative experience. Does it really change the person and how they see themselves and the world and what it means? And also, this I think relates to the one immediately above it. I think environmental psychologists need to get serious about the information environment. We're all living in a virtual world. And maybe real experience really transforms that virtual experience. We've had 10 years of nonstop information about climate change, but maybe out in the back paddock, when you saw something you've never seen before, all of a sudden, that energizes all this other exposure that you've had. Because both of these are exposure. We could talk about the difference between direct exposure and experience and indirect exposure and experience, but when you're watching an environmental documentary on how the planet's changing, actually that's pretty real. From a psychological perspective, that might be as real. It might be more real than your direct experience. So there's interesting questions there for psychologists. Respondents in 2011 were asked two other questions because we wanted to get to the bottom of this. And also, what really motivated us, we weren't getting much with all of our natural disaster experience, even though 10% of the people thought they're going to die. It just didn't seem to have much oomph in terms of how they thought about climate change. And so we asked these two questions, and there's a little bit of overlap there. And basically, we had about 8 open-ended items. 8 open-ended qualitative items with 7,500 respondents is a whole lot of work. And so this is based on a subsample of 500. But it's very interesting that if you look at this in terms of people answering this question about how it made a strong impression or what particular meaning it had and what the event was, if you look at here and here, we're talking about extreme weather events. And a couple of these others actually fall into that category as well. So immediately you're talking about over half these responses relate to extreme weather events. So again, that tells us something about this nexus between natural disasters, in this case, and climate change. But the other question was, can you tell us what your thoughts and feelings you had at the time were when you experienced this particular environmental change or event? These are very interesting. These are very emotional responses. These are responses of some real angst, anticipatory loss, feeling pretty bad about what seems to be in front of us in terms of climate change. These are real psychological impacts as well as psychological responses to the threat of climate change. And these are people who've personally experienced it and are telling us indirectly that this is maybe why it was important, why it changed them, because they were having these rather intense emotional experiences and made them think about this whole threat in a different way. And again, we don't really have time to go through this, but sadness, distress, and yearning to be able to put it all right. So many of our respondents, almost, it's like there was a moral compass out there. They said, we have to do something. I want to be part of the solution, not just part of the problem. I want to do my bit. I have to do something. And this was really rich data for us. We're still making sense of it, I have to tell you. But there was a real resolve and commitment on the part of people who were also quite reasonably distressed. And again, I don't want to take more than my time here, but so what do we make of all of this? Is the answer found in the nature of the encounter and experience, or does it relate to the nature and self-selection of those individuals interpreting and reporting experiences? Is seeing believing, or is believing seeing? Now, I, like any climate change scientist, gets a lot of stick from those who don't accept that climate change is happening. And as soon as we had this finding, we said, oh, well, how do we want to present this? Because, of course, you can anticipate that everybody's going to say, look, you've got these true believers running around out there seeing climate change under every bush, and you're calling this evidence and trying to convince us that something is going on here. However, the data is really telling us that something is going on, something pretty profound. And not only does the experience seem to be very meaningful to people, it's very influential. It's changing all of their scores on all of our core data. That's one of the strongest findings I've ever found in my professional life. You don't get data like that. And so why it's happening is really rather interesting. And our take on it is that it appears to be an interactive and cross-validating process involving both seeing as believing and believing as seeing. But also it's more than both for many people who appear to be experiencing a genuinely transformative encounter with an altered environment that they know. And it's very troubling for them. And this encounter then seems to catalyze not only prior virtual exposure and experience, but one's own motivation, issue engagement, and psychological adaptation. And while there's a lot of talk about adaptation, what is not on the radar of climate change science is that adaptation is a fundamental construct in psychology. We've been using it for 150 years. It's a whole set of processes, and a lot of it takes place inside people. If that adaptation isn't taking place inside people, it's not going to take place outside of people. And so it's a crucially important aspect of climate change adaptation that needs a better hearing. We also have been doing some structural equation modeling and looking at how our variables are kind of predicting logically other variables in the sequence. And this actually has another whole iteration here. But if you start with, okay, it's happening, an acceptance and belief, and then look at how the variables are linking, to me, I mean, it's not true for all of my colleagues, but to me what is really interesting is we developed our own measure of psychological distress in the context of climate change. Psychometrically, it's working very well as a measure. Well, psychological distress is the strongest predictor of psychological adaptation. Psychological adaptation is mediating the influence of a number of these other variables, particularly distress and self-efficacy, with respect to behavior engagement. And because our surveys actually there's about 146 items total in the survey, but some of these are multi-item scales. But because we have good psychological measures of our psychological variables, we can do much more sophisticated analyses of our data to really look at how variables are interacting and influencing each other. And one of the findings, if you want, from my own perspective, is that distress is a powerful motivator, a really powerful motivator. And most of the people that are distressed about climate change are actually channeling that into action, engagement, involvement. They really do feel they need to do something. That's not true for everybody. There are people clearly who are distressed and are not doing anything and perceptually defending and not really coping very well. And of course, that's of interest to psychologists as well, because we need to offer some advice and help to those people. We've just come across another study that's just been done and published in Nature, such as Life, where people have looked at a very similar phenomena. And they have looked at it with respect to data collected in 2008 and 2011, which was longitudinal data, so that they could look at what was happening internally with the same individuals. And they had a pretty kind of cut down version of what we've been looking at, because they were very interested in the chicken and egg question, as they phrased it, by two alternative explanations for the relationship between perceived personal experience of global warming and belief certainty that global warming is happening. And basically, they came to the same conclusion. They said, well, it's both. They're operating together. But they said what's really interesting about this, and they could do this with the longitudinal data, they're saying that actually believing is seeing is more true for those people who are very committed to climate change. They accept it, they're engaged with the issue, and they tend to see a lot of climate change out there. I have to tell you, though, that our data tells us those people are also by far much more knowledgeable about climate change than those people who don't accept climate change. And the people for whom experiential learning, direct personal experience is really important, are those people who are less ardent believers. They don't reject it necessarily, but they're not sure. They're worried, they're concerned, but you wouldn't call them true believers. And for those people, this experiential learning really changes them. And that makes sense, I guess, in that people who strongly accept that climate change is happening and are very worried about it, they've either probably already had experiences like this or they don't need them. They already know which way the wind is blowing. And let me just finish up by saying, if this is true, if direct personal experience is such a catalyzing agent for people's engagement with climate change, maybe we should be using that. Maybe we should be bringing people to places where it's happening, giving them this personal experience, changing them, and seeing what comes out of that. Of course, there's a lot of logistics in terms of how you could do that. But I and my colleague and wife, Shirley Morrissey, who is also here, we've been working for the last 10 years on psychological preparedness for natural disasters, where we walk people through what they'll be thinking or feeling in a situation of a serious warning situation, and giving them advice on how to cope with how they're feeling and how other people are feeling. So they're not just engaging in situational preparedness, but we give them a kind of Swiss Army knife of psychological advice, really good for any emergency situation, which allows you to monitor what's happening in your internal environment and being able to manage that a little bit so that you can manage the external emergency. But the problem with that, we think it might apply, but the problem with climate change, it's a global natural disaster that may be with us for the next several millennia. It's kind of big stuff. And I think we have to think about it in a different way. And I've been working for several years with the American Psychological Association, where we think that we really have to consider climate change as an environmental stressor, a background stressor that's there all the time. And we can't just think about stress and coping as we usually do. A person's lost their job, or something else has happened, they've learned they have cancer, or something's happened in their life that they're struggling with. We're talking about something happening to our global ecosystems, to the planet. And we think maybe we need a different tact for that type of psychological adaptation and coping. I might leave it there because one could talk all night about this, and I don't think I should. All that I can say is my own direction has taken me to this information environment. I'm an absolute Luddite. I don't even know how it works. But as an environmental psychologist, people are living in this virtual world. That has to matter. So environmental psychologists need to reschool themselves and look at this new environment that's out there. Thank you very much.